Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the VAWA Amendments to Clery, Recognizing and Responding to Stalking on Campus. Today's webinar is presented in partnership with the Stalking Resource Center and will cover key issues related to the implementation of the 2013 Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act, including counting stalking crimes, determining Clery geography in stalking cases, and implementing stalking awareness and prevention programming on your campus. My name is Samantha Cook, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives here at the Clery Center for Security on Campus. I will be helping to moderate and present today's webinar along with my colleague, Amy Guthrie. The Clery Center works together with colleges and universities to create safer campuses nationwide. Our programs focus on three key areas: education and training, advocacy, and policy. And we are so pleased to do so much work with so many of you here today. We're really thrilled to partner with the Stalking Resource Center for today's presentation, and we wanted to highlight just a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we encourage you to interact with our presenters today by typing in questions and comments using the questions pane found on the right-hand side of your screen. We've set aside some time at the very end of today's presentation to address some of the common questions that we received during the pre-webinar survey that so many of you were able to fill out and complete ahead of the session. And we'll also take some time, if we have some, to address any questions that you might have throughout the session that you share with us through that comments or questions panel. We also wanted to note that a copy of presentation slides was emailed to you earlier this morning, and a recording of today's session will be shared along with another copy of those presentation slides in the next day or so. You can access the recording of today's webinar also through the Clery Center's YouTube channel, and you can also subscribe to our e-newsletter to make sure you don't miss out on future webinar opportunities. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to our presenters from the Stalking Resource Center. Rebecca Drake is the Deputy Director of the Stalking Resource Center and has been with the program since 2007. She has co-authored numerous publications and guides as well as model campus policies to address stalking. She's joined by Michelle Garcia, who is the Director of the Stalking Resource Center, a position she's held since 2006. Michelle leads day-to-day operations as well as training and technical assistance efforts for the center, and both Michelle and Rebecca provide training and assistance on various aspects of stalking to multidisciplinary professionals across the country each year. We're so lucky to have Michelle and Rebecca with us today. They truly are rock stars in this area, and their expertise and insights are going to be really critical regarding this topic. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Michelle and Rebecca to get us started.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you to Amy, and thank you to all of you for being here on what I think is, for many people, possibly a cold and dreary day. This is Rebecca Drake speaking, and Michelle and I will be sort of going back and forth today, providing you some of this information in our webinar. We have just a short amount of time together today to address a lot of different things, and so you can read a little bit more about Michelle and I and about our whole team at our website. And just a quick mention about who we are, so for folks who don't know us, the Stalking Resource Center is funded by the U.S. Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women, and we provide training and technical assistance to professionals working to end stalking in their communities. Our mission really is to enhance the ability of professionals and organizations and systems to effectively respond to stalking. At the core of what we do is the provision of training, technical assistance, and really offering the best tools we can to professionals to effectively collaborate and respond to stalking, with the hope to improve victim safety and well-being, and also to hold offenders accountable. We're the only national resource center dedicated to ending the crime of stalking. And as we go throughout our webinar today, we'll give you a little bit more info about us and the resources we can offer, and also, importantly, how to be in touch with us after this webinar is over today. So what we have today for you, as you can see, is that we are going to discuss a framework for understanding stalking. We're going to touch on the definitions, and we're going to talk a little bit about the dynamics of stalking. We're going to also look at counting and geography of stalking incidents on campus, and we'll talk briefly about education and prevention programs. And to the extent possible, we will provide room for interaction and questions and answers and discussion, and be available to all of you after this webinar is over. But before we begin, we do want to thank you, especially all of you that filled out the survey questionnaire prior to this webinar. it was really informative for us to see what issues you think are the most pressing on your campus and how you're responding to all of these issues that we're going to be working on. Now, in this webinar, there's absolutely no way that we could address everything that came up, but we promise to do our best. And we also want to say that our work here is, of course, a work in progress. We're going on the best knowledge that we have, but as we all know, when the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security reporting comes out, there, hopefully before the end of the year, it may provide different guidance, but we at the SRC and along with the Clery Center will work together to distribute additional information and guidance and resources to everyone. So be sure to be in touch with us and get on our mailing list, visit our website, and we'll be sure to keep everybody updated.
So this is Michelle. As Rebecca mentioned, where we want to start out is with providing a framework for understanding stalking. Many of your questions, for those of you who filled out the survey, really focused on which definition do I use? How do I know it when I recognize it? And so we want to start at this place. How are we even defining stalking? Because the reality is we can define stalking in a number of different ways. We can look at it as a behavior, we can look at what the Clery Act says stalking is, and we can also look at what our state statutes say. Starting with the Clery Act, stalking is defined as a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to A, fear for his or her safety or the safety of others, or B, suffer substantial emotional distress. Now, several of these elements within this definition are further defined. So, for instance, course of conduct is defined as 2 or more acts, including, but not limited to, acts in which the stalker directly, indirectly, or through third parties, by any action, method, device, or means, follows, monitors, observes, surveils, threatens, or communicates to or about a person or interferes with a person's property. Now, this is a really broad definition. And from our perspective, we think this is useful because it will, in most circumstances, capture the behaviors that we see occurring within these courses of conduct, that it's repeated behavior, it's something that happens on 2 or more occasions, that sometimes it'll be direct, sometimes it'll be indirect. Third parties may be involved, what we often refer to as stalking by proxy. It also takes into account any method or any device. We'll talk a little bit about the use of technology to stalk and what a critical element that is to consider, particularly for colleges and universities who often tend to have some of the most technology proficient individuals on your campuses. So we have this very broad definition of course of conduct. The Clery Act also goes on to define reasonable person. Now, the reasonable person element we also think is very important. Reasonable person means a person under similar circumstances and with similar identities to the victim. And one of the reasons this is important is that we know amongst the different types of effects that stalking has on victims, one of the most common is minimization. Victims will often minimize the behavior they're experiencing, minimizing the risk that they face, minimize the impact that it has on their life, minimize the level of distress or fear. And so really when we approach it from this perspective of when we look at this behavior, would it cause a reasonable person under similar circumstances and with similar identities to feel fear or distress? And so it takes into account that minimization, but it also requires all of us as responders to understand the victim's experience and perspective, that really we have to put ourselves in that victim's shoes. And so when we look at stalking, anytime we look at stalking as a behavior, context is absolutely critical. That we have to see everything that's happening, and again, from the perspective of that person who's experiencing it. Because so often, stalking behaviors may have a meaning that is only understood between the victim and the offender. So for instance, let's say you have a student who comes to you and reports that they came home from class and found a dozen roses on their doorstep. Now, for many people, that's not disturbing. In fact, you know, Valentine's Day just came and went. I'm sure a lot of people would have liked to have had a dozen roses on their doorstep. But we need to understand what it means to that person. And if that student is a stalking victim who's previously been told by their stalker, the day that you're going to die is the day you find a dozen roses on your doorstep. that behavior has a specific meaning between that offender and victim. And so often we have to broaden our lens, that we can't assume we understand what something means. We have to understand what that behavior means to that victim. We also need to recognize that this concept of fear or emotional distress, they're subjective. Something that might be distressing or cause fear in me might seem harmless or benign to you. And so again, we come back to that context piece. Context is absolutely critical in stalking cases. And fear, substantial emotional distress, this element is also defined in the Clery Act. So substantial emotional distress is defined as significant mental suffering or anguish that may be but does not necessarily require medical or other professional treatment or counseling. And we, from our perspective, think it's really helpful that this is included in that definition as well, that we go beyond fear because of that minimization piece, but also because of what we know when we look at when stalking victims are asked how this behavior is making them feel. That so often as the stalking begins, you'll have victims who aren't necessarily talking about being afraid, but are talking about being anxious, being concerned, being upset, being angry. Responses that may fit into this much more broad definition of substantial emotional distress, but have not yet necessarily risen to that level of fear. And as I mentioned, when we look at the effects of stalking on victims, they are wide-ranging, that there is no one specific way that victims are going to respond, that you can see changes in eating habits, sleeping habits, victims who will be frustrated, they'll be anxious, they'll develop depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. Increased anxiety is a very common response amongst stalking victims. Difficulty with concentration, which amongst this list may not seem like the most serious, but if you are a student who's trying to succeed academically, difficulty concentrating will have a profound effect. And so we see this range of responses, and thinking about each of these may meet that definition of substantial emotional distress or fear. And again, that fear piece is subjective, right? And what we have found is that frequently the research shows victims are not necessarily saying that they're afraid. In some cases, we really need to think about how fear or distress might present themselves. So you may have someone who actually communicates, either verbalizes or communicates, yes, I'm afraid, this is happening and this is making me afraid. Or they'll use other language like this person's creeping me out, they're bothering me, or they'll talk about the effects this behavior is having on their life, that they can't sleep, they can't eat, that we can also see changes in their behavior. So they may do things like changing the routes that they take to and from class, changing class sections, or skipping class because they're in the same section as the offender. They may be avoiding staying at their home because the offender's showing up there or calling there or sending items there, so they're staying at a friend's. And we also need to just step back and think, if this person is reporting it, if they're actually coming forward and reporting this behavior, doesn't that in some way potentially indicate that they are experiencing fear or distress? Because we know that most stalking victims in general never report, so it's less than half of male victims and female victims, but when we look at campus stalking, we know that it is less than 20% of victims report stalking incidents. Most do not tell. So if they are actually coming forward and reporting, could that itself be indicative of some level of substantial emotional distress or fear? So we can define stalking as a behavior. We can define it as we see it addressed in the Clery Act. But then there's also your jurisdiction statute. And in fact, there's multiple statutory definitions of stalking. There's a federal stalking statute. Every state, the District of Columbia, and every U.S. territory has their own stalking statute. Many tribes have codes. Stalking is also a crime under the Uniform Code for Military Justice. And so one of the things that's also important to recognize is, what does your state statute say stalking is? Now, for those of you who are not familiar with your state stalking statute, we do have all the state stalking statutes available on our website, where you can go and you can look at what your statute, how your statute defines stalking. And we also have an additional tool for those of you who aren't law enforcement or attorneys who want some assistance in how to read your state stalking statute or your jurisdiction stalking statute, we actually have a tool on analyzing stalking statutes. So if you go to that page on criminal stalking laws, you can also see a resource that we have on analyzing stalking laws. And that'll just give you a little bit of a guide about how to go through and read the different elements of your statute and understand what it says stalking is under your state's law. So what do you do when you have a Clery definition of stalking and a state statute that aren't necessarily in agreement? Well, the Clery Act is very clear on this. It says that for the purposes of complying with the requirements, any incident meeting the Clery definition of stalking is considered a crime for the purposes of Clery Act reporting. So what I know from looking at state statutes across the country is that for some of you, your state statute has a much more conservative or stricter definition of stalking than the Clery Act does. But for the purposes of reporting under the Clery Act, you're going to need to use that Clery definition of stalking. So at this point, we want to take a moment and encourage you, if you have any questions about the definition of stalking, please go ahead and again use that chat or that question feature to ask your questions, and we will attempt to address as many questions as we can at the end. All right, and with that,
and Michelle, I'm not sure if it's helpful. Oh, sorry, Michelle. I'm not sure if it's helpful. I know we'll get to this a little bit later too, but I wanted to note that those local state statutes are going to be important too when you're looking at prevention education on your campus, making sure that students understand if they do want to go through the local law enforcement route, those are the definitions you should be sharing with them for reporting to local law enforcement purposes.
Absolutely, that's a great point, Sam. Yes, that under the requirements for education and prevention, one of the elements that has to be included is what your state statute says. So yes, great point. All right, I will turn it over back to Rebecca.
So I think what is also helpful when you begin to think about the education and prevention information that you might be looking at to provide to students, it's helpful to also have some understanding about the prevalence and dynamics, some of the commonalities about stalking. And, you know, sometimes the question will come up, well, why was stalking added? Or why is this such a big deal? We already have some great programming on domestic violence, on dating violence, on sexual assault. Well, one of the things that I think is helpful is to look at just how large of a problem stalking is, because it is a much larger problem than many realize in our country. And one large national victim survey, the NISVIS, the National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence Survey that was conducted by the Centers for Disease Control, showed us that 7.5 million people were stalked in a one-year period in this country. And so how this sort of broke down is that by population, when we look at that, it's by gender, 4% of women and 2% of men experienced stalking in the year that the study was conducted. The study also showed us that lifetime estimates of stalking were huge, that more than 1 in 7 women and more than 1 in 18 men were stalked at some point in their lifetime. This study and others that you can read on our website or link to on our website illustrate the reality of the prevalence of stalking. What is unfortunate is that a lot of times news reports and media reports on stalking sort of focus on sensational celebrity cases or sometimes the most outrageous cases, but the reality is that stalking is a crime that affects many people, and there are some commonalities that we're going to look at. The reality for campus populations is that the rates of stalking are quite high and actually exceed that in the general population. And intuitively, I think for folks, this makes sense because we know when we're talking about for the average sort of college-aged person, somewhere between 18 to 24, you're talking about folks who are in relationships, significant relationships, likely for the first time. Many that are on campuses are in closed, small environments. It's easy to track someone's patterns, to know somebody's schedule, as you know, schedules are pretty static for a lot of campus students. There's a lot of opportunities to find out information about others on campus, whether that's through campus websites or other social media sites. There's lots of opportunities for offenders to make it look as if they're coincidentally running into someone. So the rates of stalking on college are quite high. And we know when we look at some of the common stalking dynamics, 18 to 24-year-olds experience the highest rates of stalking victimization. Now, we also know that while anyone can be a victim of stalking and anyone can be a perpetrator, there are a few commonalities that we can pull out, one being that women are more likely to experience stalking victimization. This is not, of course, to say that there aren't male victims, because there certainly are, but women are more likely to experience stalking victimization, and many or most perpetrators are male perpetrators. One note about this is that the research has so far not necessarily included or provided good information about stalking among transgender victims and or perpetrators for that matter, but we know that stalking happens to transgender victims as well as other people who identify outside of male or female. So we're constantly looking for more information and research on that. But one final point to make about stalking dynamics is that the majority of victims know their offender. Sometimes there exists this idea that a stalker is a stranger sort of lurking behind a computer screen or hiding in the bushes waiting to attack a victim, but the reality is that most victims know their offender, and for many victims, the perpetrator is a current or a former partner. When we look at the relationship between victims and offenders, as you can see on this chart, the offender is oftentimes somebody that the victim knew. For female victims especially, it was a partner, but also acquaintances, including people from class, work, someone they went on a date with, or just someone they might casually know from campus. Stranger cases are only about 1/5 of the cases for male victims and less than that for female victims. So it's important to remember that perpetrators are known to the victim and that they can pose a greater risk to that victim. Somebody that knows the victim, knows their routine, knows their patterns, and as Michelle said, knows what can make them afraid, will know how to infiltrate their lives, will know how to get to them and how to harm them. Oftentimes they have more access to that victim. What's unfortunate, I think, is sometimes we underestimate the threat that is posed to somebody from a known offender. And when we look at what the common types of stalker tactics are, we know that stalking involves many types of behaviors. Stalking offenders will use lots of different tactics against their victims, and it's important to keep in mind that stalkers can be very creative and also very manipulative. The list you see here are some of the most common behaviors that stalking victims report receiving. We often get the question from professionals like yourselves, well, how do you know when it's really stalking? And people, I think, often struggle with this idea of quote-unquote real stalking. And I think sometimes it's difficult for people to distinguish what is stalking precisely because stalking often includes behaviors that can seem innocuous, like, as you see here, like gift giving. Or stalking can be made up of behaviors that are seen as kind of not that big of a deal, like posting messages on social media or text messages. Oftentimes, many of the behaviors that comprise that course of conduct Michelle mentioned may be behaviors that by themselves are non-criminal, and in some other context would be legitimate behaviors. It's important to remember that a course of conduct in stalking can be entirely comprised of what might be otherwise non-criminal behaviors. You can have a stalking case that occurs entirely online or through technology. You can have a stalking case that the course of conduct is gift giving and posts on social media. Again, behaviors that in another context might seem like the quote-unquote bad breakup or just somebody that can't get over it. And for some people might be seen as non-threatening and not a crime. So the reality of stalking that is comprised of all these different behaviors that can be non-criminal really contributes to the difficulty for a lot of service providers in identifying stalking, but also for victims. Michelle mentioned that victims have a tendency sometimes to minimize what's happening and may not know themselves that what is occurring is actually a crime. So it's important for us to educate ourselves on some of the most common stalking tactics, but also it's important for us to educate ourselves on this so that we can talk to victims about some of the realities of this crime. Now, we mentioned the use of technology, and this came up a lot in some of the questions that you all and the responses you had in the survey. We can't overlook the reality that so many stalking offenders are using technology to facilitate their actions. stalkers misuse technologies, legitimate technologies like the ones you see here often, to monitor, to spy, to harass, and to watch their victims. This misuse of technology we are incredibly concerned about, but we have a tendency, I think, sometimes to consider what a lot of people term as cyber stalking as something different than the other stalking. And I would argue that we need to stop talking about cyber stalking and stalking as different crimes and different realities. With the use of technology is that it's part of the same course of conduct that an offender will direct against a victim. Technology is oftentimes just a means. It facilitates what that stalker is going to do anyways. But the harms and the fears and the distress of a victim of technology-facilitated stalking are just as severe, sometimes worse, than other stalking behaviors, ones that we traditionally think of as in-person stalking behaviors. I think sometimes, though, we think that if there's this lack of proximity, that the threat isn't that high. A lot of stalking victims say that they will report technology-facilitated stalking, and someone will tell them, well, just get off your Facebook page, or just delete those messages, or just change your phone number, just get a different phone. But remember that stalkers can be clever, they can be creative, and they're going to find infinite ways to misuse technologies and to infiltrate somebody's life. One of the other things that I think happens with technology is that we all have different and varying levels of sort of facility with technology. Some technologies might seem a little bit more daunting than others, and so we have to keep educating ourselves and keep on top of all these different ways that offenders might be misusing these technologies. And we know that it's very difficult, so we're going to point you to the direction of some resources later in this webinar. But do continue to have these conversations about technology-facilitated stalking not being like sort of separate than what a lot of people think of as traditional stalking. The use of technology is often part of that course of conduct. The other thing about, the last sort of thing I want to say about some of the dynamics of stalking is that stalking often does not happen in a vacuum. It often intersects with other types of victimization, including domestic and dating violence and also sexual violence. Research shows us that there's a high correlation between stalking and dating violence and domestic violence, and the majority of intimate partner stalking victims have been previously physically assaulted by that partner. And female victims are at most risk of being stalked by a current or former partner. And it's not surprising then that there's that large connection between stalking and violence, especially prior physical assault. But we also know that stalking can intersect with sexual violence. And these are obviously crimes that the campuses that you all are responsible for capturing in your ASRs. And so when we're thinking about these dynamics and thinking about the victims and the offenders and thinking about some of their common technologies, keep in mind that many of these forms of harm and violence will overlap and intersect. And our response to these crimes will need to reflect that reality of the multi-victimization, poly-victimization. So again, we have more information than we have time for in this webinar. So if you have any questions about the prevalence, about the dynamics of stalking, about any other factual information that we can provide you, please do chat those questions or send us those questions, and we will do our best to address them towards the end of the webinar and also point you in the direction of more resources.
So how do we take what we know about stalking and apply it to what the Clery Act is requiring us to do? And so we want to focus on 3 specific areas: counting, geography, and then education programs. So in starting with counting, there's really 2 key elements to consider: course of conduct and then also the reporting period, the calendar year. So course of conduct, as I said, was already described. Clery Act talks about it as 2 or more acts, including but not limited to acts in which the stalker directly, indirectly, etc., etc. So when we think about stalking, we're again looking at that full pattern of behavior course of conduct. So you might have a situation where you have a stalker who texts the victim several hundred times, who waits for the victim outside a class, who's posting about the victim on social media, and then who we suspect has slashed the victim's bicycle tires. Even though there are multiple acts occurring in different quantities, at different times, in different types of ways, that is still just one course of conduct. And so the reporting of that would be as a we would need to think about, are we reporting that as a single report? So we actually have a scenario to go through.
Okay, so let's think of student A reporting to campus police in November of 2014 that they are being stalked by student B, who has sent them 10 text messages and 12 snaps, in addition to showing up at the library 3 times when they were studying there. So here's a poll question, and please answer to the best of what you think. How many reports of stalking do you include in your 2014 ASR? 36, 3, 1, or unsure? Go ahead and use the polling features to answer what you think. Okay, it looks like our results are in, that the majority of folks think that the answer was 1. And again, the question was, student A reports to campus police in November 2014 that they were being stalked by student B, who sent them 10 text messages, 12 snaps, and in addition have been showing up at the library 3 times when the victim was studying there. About 76% of the folks think that the answer is 1 report of stalking. Michelle?
Yes, the correct answer would be 1. It is all part of a single course of conduct that is occurring. So that would be 1 report. Now, the one thing that we want to mention is when the Department of Education originally published the rules for comment, within the rules was language around intervention, and that you would actually, within the same course of conduct, might report it multiple times after some sort of official intervention. Well, in the final rules, that intervention language had been removed. The notion of intervention will come up again in one other place, but again, in terms of counting, in terms of actual reports, when you have multiple incidents occurring, as part of one course of conduct, it is 1 report. So then in looking at the reporting period of the annual security report over the course of a calendar year, school must record a report of stalking in each and every year in which the stalking course of conduct is reported to local police or a campus security authority. In order to report it, you have to know it's occurring. So if you have a victim who is reporting across different calendar years, then yes, you are aware of that. You are not required to proactively follow up with a victim each year to determine whether the behavior has continued. However, the Department of Education has noted that institutions are not precluded from doing so. So let's say you have a student who makes a report near the end of one calendar year, say before winter break. At the beginning of the next calendar year, when school comes back into session, there is nothing that would preclude campus public safety from following up with that victim to see, is this still occurring? Is there still a risk? Is this person engaging in safety planning? And if they do determine that the stalking is still continuing, they would have to include that in that year's ASR. But again, they're not required to. However, if they do learn that the behavior has continued into another year, they must record that behavior as a new report of stalking in that year. So to think this through a little bit more, we have another scenario.
Okay, so let's try this other scenario. After student A reported, disciplinary action was initiated against student B. During the disciplinary hearing in January of 2015, student A mentions to the Dean of Students that student B is still routinely contacting them. On which annual security report, then, do you report the stalking? 2014, 2015, both, or unsure? We'll give you one more minute to look at that. But then please answer on which ASR you report the stalking.
And again, just to clarify, this is a continuation of the previous incident. So you originally had student A who reported to campus police in November 2014, and now A disciplinary action has been initiated against student B, and during the hearing in January 2015, they mentioned to the Dean of Students that student B is still contacting them.
Okay, let's see what folks were able to answer. It looks like the majority of folks, 78%, said both, that we would report on both the 14 and 15 annual security report. Michelle?
Yes, the correct answer is both. In most cases, your Dean of Students is a CSA, so that is notification, that is a report. You have the official report they made in 2014, so yes, you would have to report it on both your 2014 and your 2015 annual security report. We also did want to address issues with the hierarchy. What we know is that stalking, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, these are all going to be exempt from the hierarchy requirements. So if you think about what Rebecca mentioned earlier, that we often see stalking intersecting with other types of interpersonal, physical, and sexual violence, we need to think about how that actually gets recorded. So let's say you have a situation where the victim initially reports a sexual assault, and then during the course of the investigation, it becomes clear that the perpetrator is stalking the victim. So do you report the sexual assault, the stalking, or both? And because each of these crimes is going to be recorded outside of the hierarchy rule, it would actually get reported both as a sexual assault and as a stalking report. Again, assuming that they're all happening within Clery geography. You would report both. Now that brings us to the geography issue. And we know that this is an area where lots of folks had questions, and we have some answers for some of these. So within the Clery update, one thing that didn't change is how geography is defined. That was kept the same. So you know that you've got campus property, non-campus, and also public property. Now, stalking has slightly different requirements in terms of how it gets recorded with the geography. And the language is that an institution must record each report of stalking as occurring at only the first location within the institution's Clery geography in which A, a perpetrator engaged in the stalking course of conduct, or B, a victim first became aware of the stalking. And what I can tell you is that throughout the rulemaking process, part of this language came into being to reflect the reality that often the stalking can be occurring for quite some time off Clery geography before it moves on to Clery geography. It also could be occurring for quite some time where the victim is unaware of it, but the offender is engaging in that behavior while on Clery geography. You might also have a situation where you have a third party report the offender engaging in the behavior and the victim has no awareness of it at all. So a few things to keep in mind is that recognize that it's a course of conduct and that it crosses boundaries. What we find is that in most stalking cases, you will have some behaviors that are happening on campus property, non-campus property, public property, off-campus property, completely outside of the Clery geography. You may also be having incidents occurring in different states when the victim and offender perhaps go home for a break or travel somewhere for an internship. So really, we often see offenders crossing jurisdictions. The behavior, once it becomes reportable, once it occurs on Clery geography, in many cases will not be the first incident or the 5th incident or the 10th incident within that course of conduct. It may well have been going on for some time before it happens in that place where it is actually occurring within the Clery geography. And you will sometimes have a challenge of determining where is that first location. So how much investigation do you have to do? How much of a determination? Are we talking about the first location that we're aware of? Are we talking about the first location as we can best determine? So we have another scenario to think through.
Okay, we have student A who reports that student B has been repeatedly showing up at the parking garage, which is public property, where she parks. And she's also seen student B several times hanging around outside her workplace, which is on a non-campus. In the course of the investigation, it is determined that for weeks prior to student A noticing student B had been posting about student A on Yik Yak and had been sending anonymous emails to student A, largely from their dorm room, which is on campus. So where do you report this incident of stalking as occurring? Is it campus? Is it non-campus? Is it public property? Or are you unsure? So give you a second to look at that, and then Amy will help us with a poll. Okay, let's see where folks thought the reporting would be. Looks like 68% said campus, would report it as occurring on campus, 4% non-campus, 16% public property, and 11% not sure. This was a tough one. Michelle?
So for this one, we don't actually have a definitive answer for you, because if we go back and look at how it's defined, that it's the first location within the institution's Clery geography in which the perpetrator engaged in the stalking course of conduct. So under this scenario, it seems that that would be campus, because the first incidents that we can determine if we create a timeline here were the ones that the offender was engaging in from their dorm room. But it's or a victim first became aware of the stalking. And in this case, that may be non-campus or public property, depending on when she first noticed the offender. In this case, we are actually waiting for guidance from the handbook to clarify this language, or if it could be either location would actually meet that definition as it's defined within the Clery Act. Moving forward, we think as long as you can explain how you made that determination as to which place within the Clery geography you are reporting, then you are making that good faith effort until we get some additional guidance from the Department of Education. We also want to note that within the geography, there was discussion in the rules about what happens if there is a campus's technology being used, so say an institution, servers, networks, or other electronic means, but the perpetrator engaging in the behavior or the victim experiencing the behavior are never physically located within the Clery geography. And in these cases, those do not need to be reported. At some point, either the offender or the victim has to be within that Clery geography in order for it to be reported. Simply making use of an institution, servers, networks, or other electronic systems does not in itself make it reportable. But what I'll say from our practical experience is, again, because these are a course of conduct crimes, if you have a victim who's reporting experiencing this type of behavior and the school's networks are being used, ask the questions to see where have they been reading the emails, where have they been seeing the postings on a classroom chalkboard. So wherever those electronic behaviors are occurring, see if any of them may have actually crossed that geographic line. The other things we do want to encourage is that even if it doesn't quite yet meet this definition of stalking under the Clery Act, if it doesn't fall within the geography, there may be other ways in which you can still address that. Most schools that we've worked with actually have some type of either within their conduct codes or terms of use associated with using the school's networks or electronic or digital systems. And so even if we can't quite address this as stalking, is the offender or perpetrator engaging in behaviors that violate those terms of use or violate those codes of conduct, and might they still be subject to some type of disciplinary action? Now, we had a number of questions around geography and how to record it when you have students who are actually studying abroad. And so we're actually going to turn it back to Sam to talk about some of the considerations around study abroad.
Thanks, guys. So I wanted to pull up this sort of maze or map, if you will, actually comes directly from Jim Moore, who runs the Clery Act division of the Department of Education. And a few years back, around 2013, he gave a presentation to members of our collaborative program in Philadelphia, really specifically talking about this topic. Now, of course, VAWA amendments to Clery were still in sort of negotiated rulemaking land at that point, and so we weren't working from the final regulations. But as Michelle and Rebecca both mentioned, the definitions of geography remain unchanged. And so I think this is a really helpful tool when you're trying to consider really for any type of geography situation, but in particular with study abroad, how is it that you categorize your campuses? And so for the most part, what we try to tell campuses is that you first want to establish whether or not this is going to be considered a separate, independent campus. And the basics of that are, is there an administrator who is on the campus abroad? Does it have its own independent programs of study? Is it really operating as a separate, independent entity of the institution? And if it is, it's worth noting that under that it would be considered a separate campus, a branch campus, that would fall under the same reporting requirements as your main institution. So it would have its own annual security report, its own separate statistics that fall under those on-campus, non-campus public properties geography categories. If on the case that it's not a separate, independent, functioning program and campus, what you're going to be looking at is sort of levels of ownership and control. So own and control are going to be the terms that for Clery geography purposes you're looking at. And control, it's worth noting, is relatively loosely defined. A lot of times when we're working with campuses, their general counsels in particular have a sense of control that has to be in a lease or a written agreement that's been signed and notarized and gone through all the different legal channels. It's worth noting that for Clery reporting purposes, control is a little bit looser than that. It can be as simple as an email that goes between two university officials, for example, who are talking about shared space. So University A may have a classroom that they own, and University B wants to use it on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 8 different weeks. Well, Monday and Wednesday, Friday, during those 8 weeks, University B has control of that space and any access points that are used to access the classroom space. So again, thinking about the lens of, is it an independent campus for Clery purposes, which you can see that definition sort of listed in that second bubble there in the middle. If it's not, then what you're going to typically be looking at is a non-campus categorization. And so I'm not sure, Michelle, if you can move to the next slide, which will show you, again, this concept of own or control a building. So you still want to make sure that that building is going to be in support, or the space is going to be in support of an educational purpose. So for example, if your students decide to take their own independent field trip while they're in a study abroad program, that field trip probably will not count under Clery purposes. If, however, there's a faculty member who is taking students to a trip every single year, and it's part of a course where they get credit, that may lend itself to the educational purpose as part of an educational program. The frequently used by students is another piece. Again, that sense of recurring, the sense of an established program, these are all things to consider. And again, for most study abroad locations, if it's not its own independent campus, it's going to fall under non-campus for that same sense of it's not considered to be part of the core campus, since obviously most of our core campuses are located here in the United States and not abroad. So again, it's worth noting, I love this chart because it really kind of walks you through asking the right questions. But for most campuses, you're going to either be that separate campus for your study abroad locations or a non-campus report. Michelle, I'm not sure if we want to address any of the study abroad questions now, but I've been noting them too. I know that that's something we'll get to.
Okay,
so
and
for this,
we'll definitely try and get to as many as we can.
Yeah, awesome.
No, we'll just try and get to as many as we can.
Perfect. So for so in addition to kind of looking at study abroad, if we kind of zoom back a little bit, and I know this is something that both Michelle and Rebecca have been alluding to throughout their portions of the presentation, one of the things that I often encourage folks to consider when they're looking at, do I count this? How do I count it? You know, how do I sort of navigate all of these sort of Clery terms? Is really thinking about the basics, what I like to call the algebra of Clery reporting. And it's worth noting this is only for your annual security report, so we're not looking at things like the crime log. We're not looking at the rights and resources and options that you're providing to students or staff who are coming forward and reporting stalking victimization. You're really looking at, does this count as a statistic potentially in my institution's annual security report? And so the algebra, the factors that you're looking at are going to be first, is this a Clery crime? And so what you're looking at now with the additions of the VAWA amendments are the new Clery crimes of stalking, sexual assault, dating violence, and domestic violence. And so when you're looking at those Clery crimes, you're going to ask, is it falling under the definitions for Clery purposes? So again, you're not looking at your state statutes, you're not looking at local. For the annual security report, you're looking at those federal definitions. And then we do have hate crimes. Hate crimes are reported in a separate table. So you want to double check and look at that. There are crimes that are counted when they are bias motivated that are not falling within the Clery crimes if they are hate crimes. And then the second factor you're going to look at is geography. So after we've determined that this is a Clery crime, it's a Clery reportable offense, what you're going to be looking at is, did it fall within Clery reportable geography? So is it in an on-campus location? Is it public property? Is it non-campus? And then the final ingredient in all of this is who received the report. And so this is going to be either a campus security authority, which, as Michelle mentioned, is very broadly defined. It's anybody who is responsible, has significant responsibility for student activities on campus. Your campus security department obviously would fall under this as well. And then you're also going to be getting those statistics from local law enforcement. And this is something where every year you'll be reaching out and trying to get a sense of, within the jurisdiction that our campus is falling under, what are the reports that local law enforcement may have received that we have to include for our statistic purposes. So all of those sort of come together, the type of crime, the geography where the alleged crime took place, and who received the report are all the factors that are going to come in to decide whether or not this is something that will fall in your annual statistics. And again, it's tough sometimes within each incident to sort of get beyond the weeds of who it happened to, all of these things. I'd like to encourage folks to kind of take a step back and consider sort of this weird Clery geography, Clery crime algebra that we consider when we're looking at counting.
Thanks, Sam. I think that's really helpful. And we also want to note that the Department of Education is encouraging institutions to provide narrative information in their annual security reports to provide a fuller picture of what's actually occurring. And so, you know, talking about the course of conduct, how it goes across calendar years, addressing whether there have been interventions and whether the stalking has continued despite those interventions, the nature of it, is it short and intense or protracted over a long period, and then also how the geography plays in, where the perpetrator or the victim located on geography, was one on, one off. So really taking that opportunity to use the narrative to really show what that course of conduct is and what that crime looks like. So we also want to touch very briefly on education programs, and I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Oh, you know what, Michelle, if you just want to keep showing your slides, that's fine. We know that we have not a lot of time left, but we do want to point you in the direction of some educational programming that you can do. And Michelle, if you just want to bring up your screen again and show your slides, that would be great. We know that you all as institutions have to provide in your annual security report descriptions of the prevention and awareness programs that you're doing and that you're offering for all students and employees. And we know that the awareness and prevention programs can be offered in lots of different formats. So if you, oh, sorry, I think we're having some technical difficulties here. There we go. Michelle can bring that back up. But we want to make sure that folks know that the prevention and awareness education programming that you're doing, really when it comes to stalking, we have a lot, there's I think a lot of confusion as to what does prevention really look like when you're talking about stalking. And what we would say is that you don't overlook the importance of awareness raising as part of your prevention programming. And there's a lot of opportunities that already exist for awareness raising efforts, one being National Stalking Awareness Month, and that is in January. And each year we put out a lot of information and materials that you can pass along ideas for what you could do on campuses, and we can always direct you to what other communities are doing for Stalking Awareness Month. And we would also encourage you to blend that in with some things that awareness raising programs that your campus might already be doing. We have some ready-made things that you can make, like buttons and magnets and posters. And we also know that there are a lot of universities that have provided some of this great information and have started things like poster campaigns. You'll have in the PDF of this presentation some links to that. And so it's not necessary for you to create a whole new curriculum to address stalking if you're already doing other prevention and awareness work. Incorporate the realities of stalking into that programming. Focus on the intersectionality. Focus on how really preventing stalking is looking at having healthy relationships and healthy responses to difficult breakups, healthy responses to when people are setting down their boundaries. Some of the most effective, as we know, programming is the peer-led programming. There's also some really great bystander intervention models. A couple of organizations we've worked with that we know a lot of campuses have is Green Dot and then also Mentors in Violence Prevention. There's some great opportunities to look at really this intersectionality with stalking, dating, and domestic violence and sexual violence. So I know that we're sort of trucking through this kind of fast, but what I want to say is that this information is in your handouts, but also if you want to be in touch with us after this webinar is over, we encourage you to do so because we are funded to provide this training and technical assistance, and that can look like a lot of different things. We can provide in-person training and technical assistance and consultation where we come to your campus. We can also provide a lot of webinars, web trainings. We can do it for small or large audiences. So really to discuss what options might be beneficial, you can contact me. Please send me an email, call me. You can also, on our website is our training request form, and that page of our website also talks a little bit more about the trainings that we can provide. So please do be in touch with us after this webinar. Michelle?
So just a few additional resources for folks who are looking to get some more information around the use of technology. We do have an online training course. If you go to our website, you can find some additional information. It's a free resource. It takes about 60 to 90 minutes to complete and talks about some of the most common forms of technology we see stalkers using. And we also wanted the Clery Center to have an opportunity just to mention some of the additional resources that they can offer.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. So we do a number of trainings each year. You can check out our website. We'll post the links as well in the chat box. We also, as I mentioned before, do have a membership program. It's really designed to bring together campuses and different departments on campus to really take a proactive, comprehensive approach to Clery Act compliance, including prevention that we know is so critical to complying not only with the letter of the Clery Act, but also the spirit of the law. Every September, we do a lot of exciting free education around campus safety issues through National Campus Safety Awareness Month. So check that out. There is a link on our website, a form where you can receive more information and updates about that as we get on with planning this year. And then finally, we have an upcoming hazing awareness project that we're really excited about. More information about that will be released as part of National Campus Safety Awareness Month, but wanted to kind of put that on your radar as well. And then finally, we have, if you're in the DC area or if you are a DC enthusiast and would like to go in November, we are really excited. In about a week, we're going to announce a save the date officially for our annual conference, which this year focuses on the 25th anniversary of the Clery Act. So we're really excited. We're planning to bring together a number of experts, policymakers, to really come together and have a conversation about what the Clery Act, what its impact has been, and what it looks like moving forward. So if you can make it, it's going to be a great one-day conversation that we hope will generate a lot of dialogue beyond that day. Now, Michelle and Rebecca, I'm not sure if we want to take just 5 extra minutes. I know we're at 2 o'clock, but we did receive several questions, or if there's anything that you wanted to address that you don't feel like we got a chance to. We certainly won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm wondering if we want to take about 5 minutes or so to go through some of the common ones.
Absolutely. Michelle and I will be happy to stay on and happy to address any questions that came up. And again, please do be in touch with us directly if you want more information, if we can provide any assistance and resources for you. So, but yeah, we are definitely happy to stick around for some questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. So if you do have to leave, we are sorry that we went over, but if you can stick around, we'll spend about 5 minutes or so going through some of the common questions. I want to start, one of the more common ones was about the hierarchy rule. So just as clarity too, the hierarchy rule is referencing for Clery counting purposes. There is a hierarchy in which for some of your higher level crimes, so for example, if a sexual assault occurs as well as a burglary, only the sexual assault would be counted in that case. So that hierarchy rule is something that's been in existence throughout the Clery Act since it was created in 1990. So a lot of the questions we're getting about that hierarchy rule, in addition to what is it, was in regards to if you have a VAWA crime, so dating violence, domestic violence, or stalking, plus a regular Clery crime, so something like, for example, motor vehicle theft, how do you count those, and is it counted separately? And then another question we got was about stalking behavior. If it involves a hate crime, how is this recorded? And that kind of goes back to what Michelle was talking about earlier in terms of how hate crimes are counted separately. So Michelle or Rebecca, I'm not sure if either of you want to tackle that. Both or either.
Sam, you may be able to offer some guidance on this as well. I know that the department is still in the process of determining actually sort of like what the form will look like and how you're counting the domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and sexual assault, and so how you actually do record that when it is co-occurring with other Clery crimes, whether those are things like, you know, motor vehicle theft or also a hate crime. So I think really the answer to that we need to wait for a little more guidance from the department.
Absolutely. And in the conversations we've had with the department, again, the handbook is going to be sort of the godsend for all of us. But I think in our initial conversations with the Department of Education, what they've indicated is that reporting within your annual security report, the VAWA crimes, they are intended to be reported in a separate table, much like you would for hate crimes. And so the guidance we've received so far has been that if, for example, stalking behavior would involve a hate crime element, you would be seeing that stalking number, the stalking statistic, within your VAWA crimes table, as well as within, you wouldn't necessarily see it within the hate crimes unless it included a hate crimes component. So that's the sort of trick of it, is that if stalking, for example, included a Clery Act crime component to to it. I think dating violence and domestic violence are probably the example that comes to mind as well. So if, for example, you had an aggravated assault component with your dating violence statistic that was also for some reason motivated by bias, that would be something that you would see within all three. If, however, you're not seeing that Clery crime component, the hate crimes are not going to be including those VAWA crimes from what we understand just on their own. So it's important that you're reflecting the VAWA crimes if they include a hate crime element that also overlaps with your main Clery crime. So it's a little bit, going back to that geography algebra, this is definitely getting more complicated. But I think, again, as Rebecca and Michelle mentioned, that handbook is going to be something that's going to offer a lot more clarity. So I think beyond the hierarchy rule, we also had some questions about study abroad in terms of resources regarding international statutes on stalking. So Michelle and Rebecca, I'm definitely going to toss that over to you guys to see if there's any resources that you all are aware of in terms of how to examine international laws or statutes regarding stalking.
Sure. So there are quite a few other countries who do have stalking statutes, but there are also many countries that don't. I'll say, the United States is definitely a leader in this area, but the UK, Australia, Singapore, and many other countries do actually have stalking statutes, but you may very well have a situation where you have someone studying abroad in a country where stalking actually isn't a crime under their criminal statutes. So then what we would say is, again, look at it. If it's meeting within all of those requirements, is it still a violation under the Clery Act, and can you at least address it that way? Even in countries where it may not be a criminal act, a lot of the response should still look the same in terms of, what can we do to enhance that victim's safety? What can we do to hold that offender accountable if it's not through the criminal process, through the campus's process? We actually have information. If you're looking for whether a certain country has a stalking statute, go ahead and reach out to us directly, and we can provide that information and some resources.
That's great. And I think it's worth noting, too, as Michelle mentioned, there is no geography component to providing those resources. And that's something that we emphasize a lot with our work with campuses, is that while you may be looking at where the alleged offense took place for your counting purposes, in terms of providing students or staff with those resources when they report and those different accommodations and options, those are not tied to your geography. So it's really important that if, for example, there are different resources that are available for your study abroad programs, that you want to make sure that you're noting that and providing that information in writing to your students. So finally, I think we'll wrap up with a question that sort of gets to the heart of how campuses are notified about stalking, and then sort of the relationship of stalking victims with the university and whether or not that matters for reporting or response purposes. So the question was, what are our responsibilities for students who tell us about stalking of non-students off campus? So Michelle or Rebecca, I'm not sure if you want to tackle that one.
So I want to see if I'm understanding this. So a student has reported that someone other than them is being stalked entirely off campus, so outside of the Clery geography.
Correct.
So, while, again, based just on that information, it wouldn't be something that would be included in your annual, well, may not be included, because then my question would be, well, who's the offender and where's the offender engaging in this behavior? So there may still be an element where this is actually reportable. But I would start from the place of, again, looking at services. So let's say we determine that there's nothing about this incident that actually invokes Clery reporting. It's not happening on the geography. The offender is not in any way affiliated with the campus. None of it's happening within campus geography. What resources can we make available? What information can we provide? What options can we give to that person who is experiencing it? Recognizing, again, that this may at some point move onto the campus, may move into the Clery geography. And so the earlier that we can identify, recognize what's happening, and offer some options and possible interventions, we may be able to prevent more serious harm from occurring.
Yeah. And this is something too where a lot of questions recently have come in about memoranda of understanding with local law enforcement. And so this is an area too where if your campus does have that working relationship with local law enforcement that has jurisdiction over the area in which this alleged offense or course of conduct is taking place, that may be something where you may want to think about a situation like that when you're going to the drawing board with a memoranda of understanding, an MOU, just to determine sort of what the notification procedures would be, what rights and resources are available, all of the things that Michelle just noted. So I think that just about does it for us. We definitely have not addressed all the questions, so we appreciate all of the questions that came in, not only throughout the session today, but also, as we mentioned before, in that pre-survey. As we mentioned again, we will be sending out a recording of today's webinar along with PowerPoint slides, and both organizations are available if you do have any questions or need assistance moving forward. But thank you so much, Rebecca and Michelle. We really appreciate your time so much, and we know you have a really busy calendar, and so it was really great to be able to tap into your expertise for today's session.
Thank you.
All right, have a good afternoon, everyone.